Hello, it's Bones. I write comics, and I have a bit of a headache today, so this is going to be a short one. I was going to talk about a few things, but we're going to save some of them for tomorrow, because today we're talking about flashbacks, and I was going to talk about time skips and montages as well, but we're going to talk about flashbacks today. So, when you're writing a story, there are two ways that you can use flashbacks to your advantage. And the first way is for like a singular scene or like a singular panel, and you're just bringing in a little bit of flavor through flashback. So that's one way. And then the other way, which is much more difficult, is a flashback, plot arc, storyline, whatever. And yeah, so I want to break those two down because they're very different and both can be referred to as flashbacks, but yeah, they're very different. So the first one that I mentioned there was like a short one that is used for flavor, and I think flashbacks can be used very briefly. I guess there is kind of a blurring of the lines if you're flashing back to like a singular scene. It still kind of will have an arc to it, but generally speaking, like a short scene or a short panel where you flash back to an earlier point in a character's story or something, whatever, it's usually used as a show don't tell kind of thing. So if you have two characters chatting about their pasts, and instead of just having them be a bunch of talking heads talking to each other about that, you flash back to the scene. You can use like a framing device for this where like your character is literally like talking to another character, and then you transition it into the flashback to make it very clear with some like over the panel narrations, you know, the little square bubbles, whatever you would call those. Or you can have them reflecting on something, like they look at an object and then we move into the next panel where it's in the past with the same object. Just any sort of transition. This can happen for like a single panel, or it can be like a short little scene. I guess you can also use these same sort of framing devices when you are also like including multiple scenes and creating an overarching flashback plot. But generally speaking, if you are just using it for flavor here and there, you're good, you're golden. It's very useful. It's a way to just show instead of tell, you know, which is such a fundamental writing rule. It gives you something interesting to look at. I personally just love flashbacks and showing things. I love writing backstories for my characters, so getting to show them through actual pictures and stuff is really cool. In my comic, The Magpie, there are plenty of examples of this. There's an early scene early on with Amanda talking about a trip up north with her Nana, which is a very important scene. It's very important to the story, so showing it was important. I think you can go a little overboard with flashbacks in that regard, where like you might not necessarily want to show a flashback for every little thing. That can get kind of like tedious. You want important stuff to be important, you know, you don't want to expand upon everything because then the things that are important lose focus. The second way of using flashbacks is to make them an overarching narrative. So you would treat a flashback as you would any other plot line in your story. Generally, a flashback plot is either going to be like a character plot, or it's going to be like a question answer type plots. Like it's a story of like, how did this character come to be where they are now? And the interesting thing about a flashback plot is, while you can like put them in anywhere, like any arc, you can have them hidden within other arcs, or you can have them overarching. But generally speaking, you're going to do a lot of what you would with any other arc, where you want the big events within your flashback plot to line up with the big events in your main plot. You want to match the plot momentum, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So despite the fact that these characters are never going to actually interact because they're existing within different times, and like some of them are the exact same characters, you still get to tie these plots together around like the midpoint, around inciting incident, along pinches and plot turns. You can still line them up nicely like that because, you know, that's what you do with any plot line, and you can bring them together tonally, and you can also have the revelations that you learn in the past reflect what the character is learning in the present. So if we have a major plot turn in the story and we're having both a major plot turn happening in the past and the present, you can have it so that what happened in the past is motivating the present, and you can layer stories that way. And it's very interesting, and it's a little more difficult, but I don't think it's like impossible to learn to do this. And like any other plot, you just need to set up everything that you need to set up. And in the case of a flashback, what you need to set up is that this is in the past. You need to set up the context for like where this is. Or alternatively, if you don't even want to give away the fact that this is in the past or where it is, you just need to set up the fact that it isn't within the current time frame that it is. And like, that is very simple because you can use visual devices to get this across in comics so easily. If you just pick, you know, your sepia plot, your sepia color for the past, you're good. Just as long as you stay consistent with how you portray your scenes in the past, you're good. Like in the Magpie, it's usually black borders. That is like a scene is in the past. Bing, bang, boom, we're done. In some future stuff with the Magpie, a lot of it is in the past. I have a lot of flashbacks, maybe I have too many flashbacks, I might argue with myself, but like I really like the flashbacks. Oh my god, so many of my current stories are like living in flashback territory. Like Books of Avo 3 I'm working on, and that thing is just so many flashbacks. I love them. People hate on them, but let's be real. Like, do you guys love them? I do. I love hearing about like how like, I feel like flashbacks can get tedious early on in a story if you don't know the characters yet, but by book 3, like, give me a delicious flashback, please. Serve me up one of them traumatic backstories. Yum yum. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I have like any other advice for using flashbacks, but I don't have tons, you know? Flashbacks just kind of need to be interesting stories in themselves. They either need to be interesting scenes, interesting visuals, or an interesting storyline that aids in your main story. You don't want to just add them for no reason. You want there to be information gained through them. That's why I usually think of like flashback stories being question answer stories, but they're less for the character and more for the reader almost. Because there's often a question of like how we, like when I think of like a typical long form flashback with multiple scenes, the question is usually like, okay, this is where they started, but how did they reach the point where they're at now? And like when you go through the flashback, you get useful information that helps you uncover how they're going to overcome whatever happened in the flashback. And that's kind of interesting too when you think about it, that flashbacks tend to be like tragedies. They don't always end up being tragedies, but most of the time when you're writing a flashback plotline, it is a tragedy, just because like that's actually an interesting thought, and I hadn't really considered that. But yeah, just because of the nature of why you're using a flashback, usually it is going to end in failure because necessarily the flashback isn't successful. Otherwise, like, why would the character still need to be on an adventure, right? So I guess when you're writing a flashback, it's good to understand like how tragedy works, right? And tragedy is a very interesting thing to work with because it's sort of the reverse of most plot arcs. You tend to write tragedy for the villains plot arc, where like typically you have a hero who has a flaw and they overcome it, whereas in a tragedy they have a flaw and the flaw overcomes them. So like they tend to be doing really well at the beginning, and then by the midpoint, instead of like, you know, the ultimate failure, like in the story, like the midpoint is usually when like the hero fails in some way, but they gain the skills needed to win at the final battle. Whereas if you're thinking of a tragedy, the character is usually going to like win, but there's like the highlighting of like their hubris, right? Like their tragic flaw starts flaring up. They like overcome it just a bit, but it's going to overcome them in the end. So when you're writing flashback plot lines, they're tragic. It's usually like not going to end well for the person in the flashback, is it? Not necessarily though. Not necessarily, because you can have a parallel plot story happening in the past that ends along the same way, ends along the same time as like if you're starting a flashback story that's going from the beginning and end of the story, and you're going to be lining up all of the plot turns and pinch points and stuff, sometimes like that one's just going to be a success story, especially if it's not about the main hero or whatever, if it's something else that happened in the past. So that's like a very unique instance. I think for the most part you're going to be dealing with a tragedy, so that's neat. We love that. Anyways, that would be my advice on writing flashbacks. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm really tired. I played way too many video games. Feel bad for me. It's my tragic backstory. Oh my goodness. We should talk about tragic backstories, y'all, one day. Oh my god, that'd be crazy. Add that to the list. I know all of you be writing tragic backstories. You don't need my help. Alright, see you guys tomorrow. No cat to meow at you today, though. Sorry. Goodbye.